The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Black Hills, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Redemption Creek. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled like a warning before a storm. Most folks had already retreated indoors, their doors bolted against the creeping chill of the evening. But not everyone was seeking shelter. At the edge of town, where the last of the wooden storefronts gave way to the wild expanse of pine and rock, two figures sat on the porch of the old livery stable, their boots propped up on the railing. The Mountain Man twins, Elias and Caleb Holloway, were as much a part of the landscape as the towering pines that clawed at the sky. Broad-shouldered, bearded, and clad in buckskin and wool, they looked like they'd been carved from the mountains themselves. Their rifles leaned against the wall behind them, always within reach. The twins weren't talking. They didn't need to. After years of trapping, hunting, and surviving in the wilderness together, they understood each other with little more than a glance. Elias, the elder by 5 minutes, rolled a cigarette with calloused fingers, his sharp blue eyes scanning the horizon. Caleb, leaner but no less formidable, whittled a piece of pine with his knife, the shavings curling at his feet. Inside the sheriff's office, a lantern flickered. The building was small but sturdy, the only real symbol of law in Redemption Creek. Sheriff Harlan Boone was a hard man, but fair, and his daughter Lila was the apple of his eye. At 23, she was the talk of the territory, not just for her beauty, but for her spirit. Blonde hair like summer wheat, eyes green as the meadows after a rain, and a laugh that could make even the most hardened outlaw pause. But it was her sharp wit and fearlessness that truly set her apart. She could shoot as straight as any man, ride like the wind, and had a way of looking at a person that made them feel like she could see right through them. Lila Boone wasn't in the mood for company. She'd spent the afternoon mending a torn shirt of her father's, her fingers deft with the needle. The sheriff was out on patrol, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and the creeping sense that something was about to change. She couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over her since she'd seen the Holloway brothers ride into town that morning. There was something about the way they moved, the way their eyes lingered on her when they thought she wasn't looking. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something wild. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, and Lila set down her sewing. She stood, stretching her arms above her head, and walked to the door. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She stepped onto the porch, her boots barely making a sound on the wooden planks. The twins were still there, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. Elias was the first to notice her. He tipped his hat, a slow, deliberate movement. "Evenin', Miss Boone." Caleb didn't look up from his whittling, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Sheriff ain't back yet?" Lila crossed her arms, leaning against the porch rail. "Not yet. You two waiting for him?" Elias exhaled a stream of smoke. "Not particularly." She knew what they were doing. The Holloways didn't wait for anyone. They were here because they wanted to be, and that was that. Lila had heard the stories, how they'd survived winters that would have killed lesser men, how they'd faced down grizzlies and come out scarred but standing. They were legends in these parts, and legends didn't explain themselves. "You're blocking the road," she said, nodding toward the twins' horses, tethered to the hitching post in front of the livery. Caleb finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "Ain't no one comin' through tonight, 'cept maybe the wind." Lila felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't back down. "You don't know that." Elias chuckled, low and rough. "We know enough." The air between them crackled with something unspoken. Lila had spent her life around men, outlaws, drifters, miners, but none of them had ever made her feel the way the Holloways did. It wasn't just their size or their reputation. It was the way they carried themselves, like they were part of something bigger than the town, bigger than the law. Like they answered to the mountains themselves. She should have gone inside. She should have locked the door and pretended she hadn't seen them. But she didn't. "You boys hungry?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Elias's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "That an invitation, Miss Boone?" Lila hesitated, then nodded. "I've got stew on the stove. Enough for 3, if you're willing to share." Caleb stood, his knife snapping shut. "We'd be fools to say no." The twins followed her inside, their presence filling the small space. Lila moved to the stove, stirring the pot of stew with more force than necessary. She could feel their eyes on her, heavy and assessing. The sheriff's office was modest. A desk, a couple of chairs, a cot in the corner for her father on the nights he didn't make it home. It wasn't meant for company, especially not the likes of Elias and Caleb Holloway. She ladled the stew into bowls, the rich scent of beef and herbs filling the air. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the chairs. Elias pulled one out, the legs scraping against the floor. Caleb remained standing, his arms crossed, his gaze never leaving Lila. She handed them each a bowl, her fingers brushing against Elias's as he took it. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through her. "You cook this yourself?" Elias asked, blowing on a spoonful. Lila nodded. "Had to learn. My ma wasn't much for domestic things." Caleb smirked. "Sheriff let you near a stove?" She shot him a look. "Sheriff don't let me do much of anything. But I do what I please." Elias chuckled. "That so?" Lila sat across from them, her own bowl cradled in her hands. "You two always this quiet?" "Only when there's nothin' to say," Caleb replied. She studied them, the way Elias's beard was streaked with silver, the scar that ran from Caleb's temple to his jawline. They were hard men, but there was something else there, something that made her wonder what it would be like to be out in the wilderness with them, far from the rules and expectations of Redemption Creek. "What brings you to town?" she asked, breaking the silence. Elias set his bowl down. "Business." "What kind of business?" Caleb's smirk deepened. "The kind that don't concern you, darlin'." Lila bristled. "Everything in this town concerns me." Elias leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "You always this curious, Miss Boone?" She met his gaze. "Only when I'm being lied to." The twins exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. Then Elias sat back, his expression unreadable. "We're trackin' someone." Lila's pulse quickened. "Who?" "Man by the name of Silas Vane," Caleb said. "He's got a bounty on his head, and we aim to collect." Lila knew the name. Silas Vane was a drifter, a thief with a reputation for violence. He'd been in and out of Redemption Creek a few times, always leaving trouble in his wake. "He's dangerous." "So are we," Elias said simply. Lila looked between them, the weight of their presence pressing in on her. She should have been afraid. She should have told them to leave, to take their business elsewhere. But she wasn't afraid. Not of them. "You'll need supplies," she said suddenly, "if you're heading into the mountains." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "We got what we need." "Not if you're tracking Vane," she countered. "He knows these hills better than most. You'll need someone who knows them better." Elias's eyes narrowed. "You offering to help, Miss Boone?" Lila held his gaze. "I'm offering to make sure you don't get yourselves killed." The twins were silent for a long moment. Then Elias let out a low laugh. "Sheriff ain't gonna like that." "Sheriff ain't here," she said. Caleb's smirk was back, but there was something new in his eyes, something that made Lila's breath catch. "All right, darlin'. You're in." The fire in the stove crackled as the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Lila knew her father would be back by dawn, but dawn felt like a lifetime away. The twins didn't seem in any hurry to leave. Elias pushed his empty bowl aside, his fingers drumming on the table. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving Lila. "You ever been out past the ridge?" Caleb asked, his voice low. Lila shook her head. "Not far. Pa never let me go too deep into the hills." Elias let out a rough laugh. "Harlan Boone's got more sense than most. Those mountains don't forgive mistakes." She bristled. "I can handle myself." "We ain't doubtin' that," Elias said, his tone even. "But the wilderness ain't like this town. It don't care if you're the sheriff's daughter or not." Lila stood, gathering the bowls. "I didn't say I was going alone." Caleb's chair creaked as he leaned forward. You think your pa's gonna let you ride out with us? She set the bowls down with a clatter. I don't need his permission. Elias studied her, his expression unreadable. You sure about that? Lila met his gaze. I'm sure. The twins exchanged another glance, one of those silent conversations they seemed to have without words. Then Elias nodded. All right. We leave at first light. Lila felt a thrill run through her. She'd spent her life in Redemption Creek, bound by its rules and its expectations. But out there, beyond the town's limits, the world was wild and free. And for the first time, she was going to see it. The night stretched on. The twins didn't leave, and Lila didn't ask them to. Instead, she pulled out a deck of cards from the desk drawer. You boys play poker? Caleb grinned. You got something to wager, darlin'? She smirked. What do you want? Elias shuffled the deck, his fingers deft. How about a story? Something true. Lila considered it. Fine. But if I win, you tell me one of yours. Caleb dealt the cards, his movements smooth. Deal's a deal. They played by the flickering light of the lantern, the stakes rising with each hand. Lila lost the first round, telling them about the time she'd faced down a rattlesnake in the barn, her father's rifle in hand. The twins listened, their expressions unreadable, but she could see the respect in their eyes. Elias won the next hand, his story about a winter spent trapped in a cave with nothing but his knife and his wits. Caleb followed with a tale of a grizzly that had nearly taken his arm, and how he'd taken its hide instead. The hours slipped by. The wind outside grew fiercer, but inside, the room felt warm, alive. Lila found herself laughing more than she had in months, her usual guard slipping away. The twins were rough, dangerous even, but there was a loyalty between them, a bond that made her envious. She'd always been alone, even in a town full of people. As midnight approached, the game slowed. Lila yawned, rubbing her eyes. I should get some sleep. Elias nodded. We'll take the floor. She hesitated. You don't have to. We ain't leaving you unprotected, Caleb cut in. Not with Vane out there. Lila wanted to argue, but she knew it was useless. Instead, she pulled a spare blanket from the cot and tossed it to them. Suit yourselves. She blew out the lantern, the room plunging into darkness save for the embers in the stove. Lila lay on the cot, her back to them, but she could feel their presence, solid and reassuring. She should have been nervous, two strangers in her home, but she wasn't. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Lila woke to the sound of movement. The room was still dark, the fire reduced to glowing coals. She turned her head and saw Elias crouched by the stove, adding kindling. The flames flickered to life, casting shadows on the walls. Couldn't sleep, she whispered. He glanced over his shoulder. Old habit. Always keep watch. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. You think Vane's close? Elias shrugged. Hard to say. But he's out there. Lila swung her legs over the edge of the cot. Then we should get moving. Caleb stirred, sitting up. Sun's not even up yet. I know, she said. But if we're going to catch him, we need the element of surprise. Elias studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right. But we do this my way. Lila didn't argue. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her shirt. The twins were already saddling their horses when she stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. The sky was a deep, endless blue, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. They rode out in silence, the only sound the crunch of hooves on the frozen ground. The twins led the way, their horses sure-footed even in the dim light. Lila followed, her heart pounding with anticipation. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and forbidding. She'd seen them her whole life, but she'd never been this close. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper. The world felt bigger. Elias reined in his horse, waiting for her to catch up. You still got time to turn back. Lila shook her head. I'm not turning back. Caleb grinned, his teeth flashing white in the darkness. Didn't think so. They pushed deeper into the hills, the trail narrowing as the trees closed in around them. Lila could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding that they were hunting something, and it might be hunting them too. Then, a sound. A twig snapping, too loud to be the wind. Elias held up a hand, signaling them to stop. He dismounted, his rifle in hand, and moved silently through the underbrush. Lila followed, her own gun drawn. Caleb brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the shadows. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, a man, his clothes ragged, his face gaunt. Silas Vane. His eyes widened when he saw them. Well, if it ain't the Holloway brothers. Elias didn't lower his rifle. End of the line, Vane. Vane's gaze flicked to Lila, and his lips curled into a sneer. And the sheriff's little girl. How touching. Lila's grip tightened on her gun. It's over, Vane. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Ain't nothin' over till I say it is. Caleb stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You're outnumbered. Vane's hand twitched toward his belt, but Elias was faster. The crack of the rifle echoed through the hills, and Vane crumpled to the ground. Silence fell, broken only by the distant call of a crow. Lila's hand shook, but she didn't look away. Elias turned to her. You all right? She nodded. I'm all right. The twins exchanged a glance, then Caleb let out a low chuckle. Told you she could handle herself. Lila smiled, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She'd faced down an outlaw, ridden into the wilderness, and come out the other side. And she'd done it with the Mountain Man twins at her back. As the sun rose over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Lila knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Lila stood over Silas Vane's motionless body, her breath steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. Elias knelt beside the outlaw, checking for any sign of life before straightening up with a grunt. He's done. Caleb spat on the ground, his expression grim. Should have been done a long time ago. Lila holstered her gun, her fingers lingering on the worn grip. She'd pulled the trigger before, but never like this, never in the heat of a hunt, never with so much at stake. The weight of it settled over her, but she didn't regret it. Vane had been a snake, poisonous and relentless. The world was better without him. Elias turned to her, his blue eyes sharp in the morning light. You did good, Miss Boone. She met his gaze. Don't call me that. Not out here. A slow smile spread across his face. Lila, then. Caleb mounted his horse, his movements fluid. We should get back to town. Sheriff's gonna want to know what happened. Lila hesitated. What if he doesn't believe us? Elias swung onto his own horse, the leather creaking under his weight. He will. You're his daughter, and we're not liars. She mounted her horse, her thoughts racing. Her father was a hard man, but he was fair. He'd understand why she'd done what she'd done. Still, the thought of facing him after everything that had happened sent a ripple of unease through her. The ride back to Redemption Creek was quieter than the journey out. The twins rode ahead, their broad shoulders blocking most of her view. Lila found herself studying the way they moved, how they seemed to anticipate each other's actions, how their presence filled the space around them. They were a force, untamed and unyielding. As the town came into view, Lila felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Redemption Creek had always been her home, but now it felt different. Smaller, somehow. The streets were empty, the buildings weathered and worn. It was as if she'd stepped out of one world and into another, and now she was seeing her old life through new eyes. The sheriff's office was dark when they arrived, the door still locked. Lila dismounted, her boots kicking up dust as she hit the ground. The twins followed, their horses snorting softly. Elias tied his horse to the hitching post, his gaze scanning the street. You want us to come in with you? Lila shook her head. I can handle my father. Caleb smirked. You sure about that? She shot him a look. I'm sure. Elias nodded, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. We'll be at the saloon if you need us. Lila watched as they walked away, their long strides eating up the distance between them and the swinging doors of the Redemption Saloon. She took a deep breath, then pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. The room was just as she'd left it, the remnants of their card game still scattered across the table. Lila moved to the stove, stirring the embers back to life. She needed to be ready when her father returned. She didn't have to wait long. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Harlan Boone stepped inside, his hat in hand. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes shadowed. He stopped when he saw her, his expression unreadable. Lila. She turned to face him. Pa. He set his hat down on the desk, his gaze flicking over the room. Where'd the Holloways go? They're at the saloon. Harlan's jaw tightened. And why are they still in town? Lila met his gaze. We went after Silas Vane. Her father went still. You what? We tracked him down, she said, her voice steady. He's dead. Harlan's face darkened. You rode out with those two? They needed help, she said. And I wasn't about to let them go alone. Her father let out a low curse, running a hand through his graying hair. Lila, you don't know what you're dealing with. Those men are the only reason Vane's not still out there, she cut in. They're good men, Pa rough, maybe, but good. Harlan studied her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. You always did have a mind of your own. Lila crossed her arms. And you always did try to protect me. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's my job. It's not your only job, she said. You're the sheriff. You've got a town to protect, not just me. Harlan's gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time, Lila saw the weight of his years, the burden of keeping Redemption Creek safe, of raising a daughter alone. She felt a pang of guilt, but she didn't back down. Vane's gone, she said softly. And it's because of me. Her father looked up, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe. Or fear. You're too much like me, Lila. She smiled faintly. I'll take that as a compliment. Harlan let out a rough chuckle. It wasn't meant as one. The saloon was loud when Lila pushed through the doors, the scent of whiskey and sweat thick in the air. The twins were at a corner table, a bottle between them. They looked up as she approached, their expressions unreadable. Elias pushed a glass toward her. Thought you might need this. Lila sat down, taking the glass. The whiskey burned as it went down, but she welcomed the heat. Pa knows. Caleb raised an eyebrow. And he's not happy, she admitted. But he understands. Elias leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. He's a good man, your father. He is, she agreed. But I'm not a child anymore. The twins exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations that seemed to pass between them. Then Caleb grinned. No, you're not. Lila took another sip of whiskey, the warmth spreading through her. What happens now? Elias studied her for a long moment. That's up to you, Lila. She looked between them, her heart pounding. She'd spent her whole life in Redemption Creek, but now the world felt bigger, wilder. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. I could go with you, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Caleb's grin widened. You want to be a mountain woman? She laughed, shaking her head. I don't know what I want. But I know I don't want to stay here. Elias's expression softened. It ain't an easy life, Lila. I don't want easy, she said. I want real. The twins were silent for a long moment. Then Elias nodded. All right. But you ride with us, you follow our rules. Lila met his gaze. I can handle that. Caleb let out a low chuckle. I don't doubt it. The next morning, Lila stood outside the sheriff's office, her pack slung over her shoulder. Her father was inside, his silhouette visible through the window. She'd said her goodbyes the night before, the words heavy between them. He hadn't tried to stop her, but she'd seen the worry in his eyes. The twins were waiting for her, their horses saddled and ready. Elias held out a canteen, his expression serious. Last chance to change your mind. Lila took the canteen, securing it to her pack. I'm not changing my mind. Caleb mounted his horse, his gaze sweeping over her. Then let's ride. She swung onto her horse, the leather creaking under her. The twins led the way, their broad backs blocking the worst of the wind. Lila took one last look at Redemption Creek, at the town that had been her home for so long. Then she turned her horse toward the mountains and didn't look back. The trail was steep, the air thin and sharp. Lila could feel the altitude in her lungs, but she didn't slow down. She'd spent her life waiting for something, she just hadn't known what. Now, as the wind whipped through her hair and the twins rode beside her, she realized she'd been waiting for this. For freedom. For adventure. For a life that was hers and hers alone. Elias reined in his horse at a ridge, the world stretching out before them, endless peaks, deep valleys, and the promise of the unknown. He turned to her, his eyes bright in the morning light. You ready? Lila smiled. I'm ready. Caleb grinned, kicking his horse forward. Then let's go. They rode into the wilderness, the three of them, the wind at their backs and the mountains rising up to meet them. Lila didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And she knew, no matter what came next, she'd never look back.